White police humiliate black elderly woman on her own porch, but when her son arrives, the outcome is completely shocking. It was a sunny day in the small town of Maplewood, and Mrs. Evelyn Johnson was slowly walking home, a shopping bag in hand and a calm smile on her face. At 68, she had always been a dignified and respected presence in the neighborhood, known for her kindness and ability to make others feel welcome. The sun shone brightly, illuminating her gray hair that swayed gently in the breeze. However, her peace was about to be abruptly interrupted. As she crossed the street, two uniformed police officers, Officer Bradley Miller and his partner Jake Adams, appeared out of nowhere, blocking her path. The tension in the air was palpable. Bradley, a young man with a stern expression and an aggressive stance, looked at Evelyn with disdain. "Hey, Mom! You fit the description of a robbery suspect. Let's see what you have in your bag," he said, his voice heavy with authority. Evelyn, surprised and confused, raised her hands in a gesture of defense. "But I just came back from the supermarket, officers. I'm a law-abiding citizen. I have nothing to hide," she replied, trying to remain calm. Jake, who remained silent, had a similarly hostile look, as if she were an imminent threat. "Silence. We're not here to hear your story," Bradley interrupted, stepping closer to her. "Just show us what's in the bag." Evelyn hesitated, her heart racing. "Please, that's not necessary. I just bought some groceries for dinner." The officers ignored her. Bradley grabbed the bag, yanking it forcefully. "And what if you're lying? Let's see what you really have." He began to rummage through the items, scattering vegetables and cans across the ground. The contempt in his gaze was clear, and the humiliation Evelyn felt intensified with each passing second. Margaret Parker, a longtime friend and neighbor of Mrs. Evelyn, was on her porch when she witnessed the scene unfold. Despair seized her as she realized that the woman she had always admired was being treated like a criminal. "Hey, what are you doing? This isn't right!" Margaret shouted, rushing towards the officers. Jake quickly turned around, his expression threatening. "Step back, ma'am. This is none of your business," he said, pushing Margaret back with a brusque gesture. She almost lost her balance but regained herself, her determination growing. "She's not a criminal. You have no right to do this." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears at the sight. "Margaret, please don't. It's better if you go back," she pleaded, her voice trembling. But Margaret refused to be intimidated. "No, Evelyn, you deserve respect. They can't treat you this way." Irritated by the interruption, Bradley turned to Margaret. "You want to get involved, Ma'am? Then let's do this the hard way." He stepped closer to her, threatening her with a fierce look. "Back off or you'll regret it too." At that moment, Evelyn couldn't bear the anguish any longer. "Enough! I'm an elderly woman, and this is an abuse of power," she shouted, her voice echoing down the street. Bradley's expression hardened even further, and he refocused on Evelyn as if nothing else mattered. Neighbors began to gather, watching the scene with concern and indignation. The atmosphere became heavy, and the sense of injustice was palpable. Evelyn felt the eyes of others upon her, but what hurt her the most was the lack of empathy from those men who were supposed to protect the community. As the scene unfolded, the quiet life of Evelyn Johnson was crumbling, and the humiliation she was enduring became a rallying cry for all who were witnessing it. Mrs. Evelyn Johnson walked slowly back into her home, each step weighing on her heart, still pounding from the humiliation she had just suffered. The sun shone brightly, but the light of day seemed powerless against the shadow that had settled in her soul. The cruel words of the officers echoed in her mind, like a distant echo growing increasingly deafening. Upon opening her front door, Evelyn felt as if she were stepping into a temporary refuge, a space that had once been welcoming, now stained by shame. Tears began to slide down her wrinkled face as she fell onto the sofa. What had happened had turned her into a stranger in her own home. The memory of her grandchildren's laughter and the joyful conversations she used to have with them felt so far away. Margaret, her friend and neighbor, was there in the blink of an eye. She had witnessed the scene, and the despair in her gaze was palpable. "Evelyn, I can't believe what happened. This is unacceptable," she exclaimed, her voice choked with indignation. She moved closer and hugged Evelyn, trying to comfort her. "You need to tell David. He can help." Evelyn shook her head, still in shock. "Margaret, I don't want to cause more trouble. I'm too old for this. They won't listen to me, and I'm just a black woman in a world that doesn't care." "Don't say that. You're strong and your son is a civil rights lawyer. He knows the fight, and he will fight for you," insisted Margaret, holding Evelyn's hands. "Please, let me call him. He needs to know what happened." Reluctantly, Evelyn agreed. Margaret grabbed her phone and dialed David's number while Mrs. Johnson watched, hope and fear intertwining within her. In a matter of seconds, David's familiar voice echoed from the other end of the line. "Hi, Mum. How are you?" David asked, concern evident in his voice. "David," Evelyn began, but emotion choked her words. Margaret took the initiative and spoke. "David, it's Margaret. Something terrible happened to your mother. She was confronted by police, and they humiliated her in front of everyone. We need your help." The silence on the other end of the line felt endless. Finally, David responded, anger evident in every word. "What? How could this happen? I'm coming over right now." Hanging up, David felt his heart race. Memories of his childhood, when his mother had always been a bastion of strength and dignity, flooded his mind. He remembered how she had always taught him to stand up against injustice, to not remain silent in the face of abuse. Now he felt as if he had failed, as if every lesson had been put to the test. When David arrived at his mother's house, he found her sitting on the sofa, her eyes swollen and her expression lost. He approached her and enveloped her in a tight embrace. "Mom, I'm here, you're not alone," he said, his voice soft yet firm. "David, I don't know what to do. I feel so weak," Evelyn confessed, tears streaming down her face. "You're not weak, Mom. What happened was horrible, but I promise I will fight for you. We'll gather evidence, testimonies, whatever it takes. This can't go unpunished," he replied, determination swelling within him. "I just want this to be over," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "And it will be. But we need to act now. I'll talk to Margaret and see what we can do. We need the community on our side. They need to know what happened," David asserted, his resolve growing with every word. Evelyn looked at her son, feeling a mix of pride and sorrow. "Thank you, my son. I trust you. I just hope this doesn't hurt more people. We'll take care of this together, Mom." "You're stronger than you think," David said, holding her hand as a new spark of hope began to shine amidst the darkness surrounding them. David was determined to seek justice. As soon as his conversation with his mother ended, he grabbed his car and drove swiftly to the neighborhood where Evelyn lived. Upon arrival, his mind was racing with ideas and strategies. He needed to gather evidence and testimonies, and for that, witnesses were crucial. The next day, David began his investigation. He decided to start with the neighboring houses, where he believed some people might have witnessed the incident. With a notepad in hand and a recorder, he knocked on the door of the first house. An elderly woman, white-haired and weary-eyed, answered. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm David Johnson, Mrs. Evelyn's son. I'm investigating what happened to her yesterday. Were you home?" The woman hesitated, glancing around as if worried about the consequences of her answer. "Oh, yes, I was," she replied, her voice trembling. "I saw everything. Those police officers were very aggressive." "Could you tell me what you saw?" David encouraged her, speaking gently and understandingly. "They surrounded her as if she were a criminal. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was sure she was an innocent woman, and still—" Her voice faltered, and David sensed the pain in her words. "Thank you for sharing this with me. It's very important," David said, jotting everything down. He knew that every testimony mattered, and the community's voice needed to be heard. Moving on, he visited more houses, speaking with other witnesses. At each door he opened, David found a new story of indignation and fear. A woman who lived 2 blocks down revealed that she had already witnessed similar abuses by the same police officers. "They act as if they are above the law, David. I don't know how this can continue," she said, tears in her eyes. "No one does anything." David listened attentively, feeling the bitterness of the community. With each testimony, his determination grew. He finally managed to access the security footage from a nearby store. Sitting in a cafe, he watched the video repeatedly. The image of Mrs. Evelyn being roughly searched made him feel sick. He noted the times, angles, and every detail that could be useful in court. "This is unacceptable," he murmured to himself, as anger began to boil within him. He knew he needed to act, not just for his mother, but for everyone who had suffered at the hands of the same injustice. In the following hours, David met with local activists, a small but passionate group fighting against police brutality. The room was filled with energy, voices rising in unison. "We need to mobilize the community," exclaimed a woman, raising her fist. "A protest could be key." "And we need a spokesperson," a man added, looking directly at David. "You're Mrs. Evelyn's son, and your story can inspire many." David felt the weight on his shoulders. He didn't want to be just a name. He wanted his fight to be for everyone. The group began discussing strategies, such as making posters, contacting the media, and mobilizing people. David felt reinvigorated. He knew the community needed action, and he was ready to lead this fight. "Let's show them that we're not alone," David said firmly, looking into the eyes of each person present. "It starts here and now." As the meeting progressed, he realized that the voices around him were not just echoes of pain, but a symphony of hope and resistance. David smiled, feeling the strength of solidarity. He knew the battle would be long, but he was determined to fight, not just for his mother, but for all who had suffered unjustly. And looking at the determined faces around him, he understood that this struggle was more than personal. It was a fight for dignity, respect, and equality. As David dedicated himself to his investigation, the friendship between Evelyn and Margaret became a refuge amid the storm. Sitting in Evelyn's living room, surrounded by family photographs and memories of simpler times, they discussed what had happened. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating Evelyn's worried expression. "Evelyn, you know you're not alone in this. We will get through it," Margaret said, her voice firm yet gentle. She held Evelyn's hand, trying to convey some strength. "I just can't believe this happened to me, Margaret. I always taught my children to respect authority," Evelyn replied, her voice shaky. "And now, after everything I've been through, I feel like I've lost my dignity." "You haven't lost anything, dear. The indignity doesn't come from you, but from them," Margaret affirmed with a determined look. "You are a strong woman. Your story needs to be told." Evelyn nodded, but had doubts. "What if nothing changes? What if David can't get justice?" "David is a fighter. He won't give up, and we will stand by him," Margaret assured. The two women exchanged a knowing glance, a silent pact of resistance. Elsewhere in the city, David sat in a cafe, discussing strategies with Margaret. He was restless, bouncing his legs under the table. "Margaret, we need to act fast. The longer we wait, the easier it will be for them to bury this." "I know, David, and I'm willing to be a witness. I can't just stand by while your mother suffers like this," Margaret replied, her determination palpable. "This could have serious consequences for you. Are you aware of that?" David looked her in the eyes, concerned for his friend's safety. "I am." "Toika, but what is the risk compared to the injustice I've seen?" Margaret insisted, firm in her decision. "If I do nothing, I will be complicit. We need people to see what really happens." David took a deep breath, admiring Margaret's courage. "You're incredible. Together we can make the community hear our voices. And not just that. We need to go to a community meeting this week. Many people need to know they are not alone," Margaret suggested, her enthusiasm growing. "That's it. We can collect testimonies from other victims. This will support my mum's case," David replied, starting to visualize the plan in his mind. "If we can unite these stories, this injustice cannot be ignored." The atmosphere was charged with hope and determination. At the community meeting, the racial tension was palpable. David and Margaret sat at a table, watching the people arrive. The buzz of conversations mingled with the sound of chairs being dragged. When the moderator called for order, everyone fell silent, and David felt the weight of the moment. "We need to talk about what happened to Mrs. Johnson," David began, standing up. "She is not just a statistic. She is a mother, a friend, a sister, and what happened to her is unacceptable." Margaret stood beside him. "And it's not just her story. Many others in this community face the same kind of abuse. We need to unite and demand change." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Some people started nodding, while others exchanged looks of understanding. David felt they were touching on something deep and necessary. He looked into Margaret's eyes, who offered an encouraging smile. "Let's stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves," David declared, his heart pounding. "And together, we will ensure this never happens again." The room echoed with applause and shouts of support. The faces that had been somber now reflected determination. Amid those united voices, David felt that his mother's struggle was not just hers, but that of the entire community. And with Margaret by his side, they were ready to face whatever lay ahead. The courtroom was packed with people, the atmosphere thick with tension and expectation. The murmurs of the crowd faded when the judge entered, banging the gavel and ordering everyone to sit. David was at the plaintiff's table, his heart racing with adrenaline. He looked at his mother, Mrs. Evelyn, sitting in the front row, her eyes glistening with tears but filled with hope. Beside her, Margaret held her hand, offering a silent yet powerful support. David stood up, adjusting his tie, and began to present his evidence. He showed the security camera footage where Mrs. Evelyn's humiliation was evident. The images depicted the brutality of the police, how they treated her like an object rather than a person. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," David started, his voice firm and clear, "you are witnessing a woman who was treated inhumanely. She is not just a victim, she is a mother, a grandmother, and a vital part of our community. What happened to her reflects the injustice that many face daily. And this must stop." As he spoke, the room was in absolute silence. Each word from David seemed to echo against the walls, capturing everyone's attention. He pointed at the footage, reinforcing the gravity of the situation. These men, the defendants, not only abused their power but also perpetuated a cycle of racism that has lasted far too long. Then, amid the audience's clamor, a document was passed to the judge. The judge read it aloud, and the words that came from his mouth seemed to freeze time. "Bradley Miller and David Johnson are half-brothers, both sons of Samuel Johnson." The murmurs began to spread through the room like wildfire. David felt a chill run down his spine, his heart racing. He looked at Bradley across the aisle and saw the shock on his face. "Half-brothers," Margaret whispered, looking at David, who was still processing the information. A whirlwind of emotions surged through his mind. Anger, confusion, and sadness intertwined in a tight knot in his chest. He didn't know how to deal with this new reality. Bradley, still in shock, slowly stood up. "This cannot be true," he murmured, looking at the judge. "This cannot be true." His voice was choked and the tension in the room was palpable. David couldn't take his eyes off Bradley. The man who had humiliated his mother, who represented everything he was fighting against, was also part of his own story. "It's true, Bradley," David said, his voice now calmer but still filled with emotion. "We share the same father, and more importantly, we share the responsibility for this." The room was heavy with silence. David turned to the audience. "What does this mean for us as brothers? What does it mean for you, Bradley? You can continue to be part of the system that oppresses and humiliates, or you can choose to become a force for change." Bradley looked at David, and for a moment, the world around them disappeared. He saw the pain in David's eyes, the weight of the actions he had taken. I didn't know," he began, his voice trembling. "I didn't know you were my brother." "You became what the system expected of you," David replied, his voice now softer, almost a whisper. "But you still have a chance to change. Look around you. The community is here, demanding justice. You can be part of the solution, not just the problem." Bradley's eyes filled with tears and he looked at Mrs. Evelyn, who observed with a pained and confused expression. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything I did." The audience was in shock, the tension palpable. David could feel the weight of the moment, as if the room was waiting for a response. He felt that the line between right and wrong was dissolving, and the true battle was just beginning. What would happen next was not just about justice, but about the possibility of redemption and the search for a new path. The revelation that united David and Bradley as half-brothers hung in the air like a storm about to break, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. David felt his heart race as the reality of what he had just discovered unfolded in his mind. The mix of anger, pain, and a strange sense of compassion consumed him. How could his own brother be part of the system that had humiliated his mother and so many others? He looked at Bradley, who was sitting at the defendant's table, his eyes lost, as if he were trying to find a way through the confusion. "David, this isn't what it looks like," Bradley whispered, his voice trembling. He seemed like a lost boy, seeking an explanation he couldn't comprehend. "I didn't choose to be a cop. I just wanted to do what's right." "Do what's right," David replied, his voice heavy with incredulity. "Do you really think assaulting an elderly woman is doing what's right? You've become part of a system that oppresses and humiliates people like my mother." The courtroom was silent, all eyes fixed on David and Bradley. The tension was almost unbearable. David's words echoed like a call to conscience, but Bradley hesitated, wrestling with the truth before him. He remembered his childhood, his father's teachings about law and order, and how those concepts were deeply ingrained in his identity. But now, with David in front of him, reality was crumbling. I didn't want this to happen," Bradley murmured, his voice choked. "But I've always done what I was told. I always wanted to be a good cop, a good son. I never thought it could hurt someone." "So you never stopped to think about what your good cop really means for the people you're supposedly protecting?" David's indignation grew with every word. "You just accepted what you were taught without questioning it, and now you're here, in front of me, a man who has the power to change all of this. Bradley looked down at the floor, the weight of David's words crashing down on him like an avalanche. He didn't want to be that man. What had started as a desire to follow in the footsteps of a distant authoritarian father had turned into a nightmare. He remembered the nights he came home and his father praised him for maintaining the order. But now, he wondered, what order was that? Bradley, David said, his voice softening a bit. You need to understand that it's not too late. You can be more than this. You can choose. You can make a difference. In that moment, Jake, Bradley's partner, who had remained silent until now, felt the weight of the conversation. He was tired of living in a world where racism and brutality were normalized. Bradley, I don't want to be part of this anymore, he admitted, looking at David. I don't agree with what we've done, and I'm starting to realize that it's not fair. Bradley turned to Jake, surprised. You too? The question came out almost as a whisper. He had never imagined that Jake, his longtime friend, would think that way. Yes, Jake replied, his voice now firm. We can't keep going like this. We need to change. What we're doing isn't right. The conversation between the three men was becoming a turning point. David, seeing Bradley's internal struggle, decided it was time to give his brother a chance. If you really want to change, then start here and now. Acknowledge what you've done. Accept the consequences. But also do something with that pain. Use it to help others. Bradley looked into David's eyes, confusion still evident, but now there was a glimmer of hope. Do you really think I can change? He asked, a thread of vulnerability in his voice. I believe that we can all change if we're willing to confront our truths and the pain we've caused, David replied firmly. And I'm here to help you if you want. The atmosphere around them seemed to calm, as if the heavy tension was beginning to dissipate. Bradley knew he had a long way to go, but the idea of redemption, of becoming someone who could make a difference, began to take root in his heart. He took a deep breath, feeling that perhaps there was a way out, an opportunity not just to free himself from his mistakes, but also to help change the course of his life and the lives of many others. The pressure in the community surrounding Evelyn Johnson's case was growing like a volcano ready to erupt. The atmosphere was charged with indignation and hope as the trial date approached. David, who had become the face of the resistance, could not ignore the weight of expectations resting on his shoulders. He knew that every word, every piece of evidence he presented in court could be the difference between justice and impunity. On the morning of the protest, David and Margaret met in a park near the courthouse. The sun was shining, but the light could not dispel the tension hanging in the air. Groups of people were gathering, carrying signs emblazoned with messages of justice and equality. Black Lives Matter, Enough with Abuse of Power, and Justice for Evelyn were some of the slogans echoing in the crowd. Margaret held a sign that read, Evelyn, we stand with you, and looked at David with a mix of pride and concern. Are you ready for this? She asked, her voice almost choked with emotion. I don't know if I am, but we can't back down now. This is bigger than me, bigger than us. It's for all the mothers who have suffered, David replied, his determination unwavering, even as his heart raced in his chest. He looked at the crowd, their faces filled with hope and pain. This was the time to unite, to show that the community would no longer accept abuse. As the protest began, the energy intensified. Several people started chanting, and David joined them, feeling the power of unity. Justice, justice, echoed through the square, resonating against the walls of the nearby courthouse. It was as if the very building was listening, about to be confronted with the truth that had been suppressed for far too long. Meanwhile, Bradley Miller and Jake Adams watched from a distance, surrounded by fellow officers. The tension was palpable. These protests are going to end badly, Jake murmured, his expression tense. I think the community is really furious this time, and rightly so, Bradley replied, his voice low. But what can I do? I'm just a police officer. He looked at the crowd, which seemed more determined by the minute. This isn't going to end well for anyone. The protest continued, and David, amid the agitation, felt he needed to speak. Climbing onto a makeshift platform, he called for silence. The crowd stopped and looked at him, curious. We are here to fight for justice, not just for my mother, but for all those who have been silenced by a system that doesn't care about black lives, he shouted, his voice resonating with fervor. We cannot let fear paralyze us. We must demand change, not just for us, but for future generations, he continued, as the crowd's applause grew louder. This fight is not just mine. It is not just for Evelyn. Seosam, it's for all of us. The community responded with shouts of support and applause, and the energy they collectively created was almost palpable. Each shout was a declaration of resistance, each sign a promise that they would not give up. The strength of solidarity was a powerful reminder that justice was not a luxury but a right. Meanwhile, Bradley and Jake's eyes met the crowd. Jake, observing the determination on people's faces, began to question his own loyalties and the values he had always upheld. "Bradley, can't you see? They're tired. We should be tired too," Jake said, doubt starting to creep into his voice. Bradley shook his head, still reluctant. "But I'm a police officer, that's what I do. What do you suggest, that we join them?" "Maybe we should start thinking about how we can change things from the inside," Jake suggested, his voice hesitant but sincere. "We can't be part of the problem. It's not right." The crowd began to chant a new mantra. Change! Change! David noticed the transformation happening not only in his community, but also within Bradley and Jake. What once seemed like a hopeless situation was now turning into fertile ground for change. This is just the beginning, David thought, as he watched the community unite, ready to face whatever came next. The fight for justice was just starting, and he was determined not to give up. The courtroom was electrically tense. Chairs creaked under the weight of an anxious audience, and the smell of legal formalities hung in the air, mixed with the palpable expectation of justice. David stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this moment was crucial, not just for his mother, but for the entire community that had rallied around the case. He looked at the judge, who encouraged him to proceed, and then turned to face the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," David began, his voice firm yet laden with emotion, "today we are not just here to judge an act of abuse of power. We are here to confront a system that has failed to protect the most vulnerable among us. Mrs. Evelyn Johnson is a woman who has dedicated her life to her family and her community, and yet she was treated like a criminal, humiliated in front of her neighbors." He paused, allowing his words to resonate in the room. Bradley's expression, sitting next to Jake, was a mix of disdain and nervousness. David, however, would not be shaken. "The recordings we've presented clearly show the unnecessary brutality with which Mrs. Johnson was treated. The interactions she had with these officers are not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern of behavior that perpetuates racial violence in our community." As David spoke, the tension grew. He felt the room completely focused on him, absorbing every word. The defense attorney, a robust man in a dark suit, stood to object, but the judge cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Please continue, Mr. David," the judge said, and this gave David renewed energy. He turned back to the jury. "But what happened today is not just about Mrs. Johnson. It's about all of us. It's about our collective responsibility to stand up against racism and injustice. And this brings me to a revelation that could change everything." David hesitated for a moment, looking intently at Bradley. "Recently I discovered that Officer Bradley Miller and I are half-brothers, sons of the same father." The murmurs that followed in the courtroom were almost deafening. He continued, "This truth does not alter what happened, but it forces us to reflect on what our family and society have taught us about loyalty and morality." Bradley turned pale, his posture rigid. He looked down as if trying to hide from the reality being exposed. David, however, would not back down. "Bradley," he said, his voice now softer, "how can you justify your actions? How can you be part of a system that oppresses and humiliates? You see yourself as a law enforcer, but today you are a symbol of oppression." Bradley lifted his gaze, his eyes filled with conflict. I don't know what to say, David. I grew up believing I was doing the right thing, following orders. But now, all of this, it all feels so wrong." His voice was a whisper, almost inaudible. "You have the opportunity to choose a different path," David replied, determination growing in his voice. "You can be part of the change our community so desperately needs. Acknowledging your failings is the first step toward redemption. You are not alone in this. We all have to confront what is wrong within us." The audience was in absolute silence, each person absorbing the intensity of the scene. The tension in the room was almost palpable as everyone awaited Bradley's response. He looked at the judge, then at the jury, and finally at David, who was watching him with hope and expectation. "I can't change what I did," Bradley began, his voice trembling. "But I can try to do better. I'm willing to listen and learn. I want to understand. I want to be part of a solution, not the problem." At that moment, the courtroom seemed to transform. The weight of Bradley's words hung in the air, and the hope for change ignited, even in the face of the pain and suffering that had been exposed. David felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He knew the struggle was far from over, but maybe, just maybe, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. The courtroom was enveloped in tense silence, as if the air was charged with expectation. David watched his half-brother Bradley across the room. Bradley's face was pale, his restless hands resting on the table. There was a palpable conflict in his eyes, an internal battle slowly unfolding as he prepared to face the consequences of his actions. The condemnation of the police officers was imminent, but the real struggle was happening within Bradley. Nearby, Jake, his partner, stared intently at the table, lost in thought. Finally, unable to bear the weight of the situation any longer, Jake turned to Bradley and with a choked voice said, "You need to decide, Brad. You can't keep going like this. Look at what we're doing. Look at your family, at his mother. This isn't who we are." Bradley took a deep breath, the expression of pain on his face intensifying. "I always thought I was doing the right thing, keeping order. But now, all of this, it all seems so wrong," he murmured, his voice barely holding up. "I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be what my life has shaped me to be." He looked at Jake, seeking support. "But how can I change? How can I free myself from this?" Jake, who had always been loyal to the system, began to realize what was at stake. "You need to face the truth, Brad. We are not just our choices. We are also what we choose to leave behind. You can't ignore that anymore. Look at what's happening here, to your mother and to his mother. The pain we've caused, the choice to be better must come from within. But you have to want it." Bradley closed his eyes, Jake's words sinking into his mind. He remembered his childhood, moments when his father's figure was absent, leaving a void he never knew how to fill. He always felt pressured to fit into a mold, to be the protector, the defender of the law, even if that law was unjust. "Do you really think I can change? That I can leave all of this behind?" His voice was heavy with insecurity. "Yes, I believe you can," Jake replied sincerely. "But you need to put in the effort. You need to be honest with yourself, confront what you've done and how it has affected those around you. It won't be easy, but it's the only way to find peace." Bradley looked again at David, who was focused on his own struggle, seeking justice for his mother. David's gaze was one of determination, but also of pain. The weight of the situation fell on Bradley's shoulders, and he felt paralyzed by guilt and shame. "I don't know if I'm capable," he whispered, almost as a plea for help. David, across the room, felt a slight movement and lifted his eyes. He noticed Bradley looking at him. In that moment, something ignited within David. The desire to understand his brother, to see if there was a path to redemption, emerged as a fragile hope. With a decisive gesture, David stood up and slowly walked over to where Bradley was. "Bradley," David said, his voice firm yet filled with emotion. "I know you're struggling, and I know you are more than your actions. You have the chance to make a difference, to stand up against the system that shaped you. You can become a man who fights for justice, not just for yourself, but for those who need you." Bradley looked at David, his heart racing with a mix of fear and hope. "What if I fail? What if I can't be the person you see? Failing is part of the process. What matters is that you try, that you choose the right path, even if it's difficult. We have the opportunity to change our stories, to rewrite what it means to be brothers, and to stand up for what is right." David paused, allowing his words to resonate. "But you need to want this. You need to want to change." The conversation between them was witnessed by a room full of people, but in that moment, everything faded away. It was just David and Bradley, two men battling the ghosts of their childhoods, trying to find a way forward. The hope that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible began to blossom between them. The courtroom was packed, everyone anxiously awaiting the verdict. The atmosphere was tense, and the anticipation hung in the air like a heavy fog. David sat with his breath caught as the judge prepared to pronounce the decision. He looked at his mother, Evelyn, sitting beside him, her eyes red and swollen from crying, but with an expression of renewed hope. The presence of the community, gathered in support of Evelyn, was a reminder of the strength that unity could bring. "Silence in the court," the judge commanded, taking a dramatic pause before continuing. "After considering all the evidence presented, this court finds the defendants, Bradley Miller and Jake Adams, guilty of abuse of power and racially discriminatory." A murmur swept through the room, and David felt his heart race. He glanced at Evelyn, who covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her face. It was a moment of relief, but the battle was far from over. Bradley, sitting next to Jake, seemed to crumble under the weight of the verdict. He stared at the floor, his fingers trembling, as the reality of his actions hit him like a blow. The room fell silent, all eyes on him, waiting for any sign of reaction. Finally, he stood up. The movement was hesitant, as if he were struggling against an invisible current. I would like to say something," Bradley began, his voice choked with emotion. I don't know how to justify what I did, and I can't change the past, but I am truly sorry. I am sorry for the pain I caused Mrs. Johnson and her family." He paused, emotion overflowing. "I am sorry for being part of a system that perpetuates this pain. I didn't know. I didn't want to see." The room was in absolute silence, the tension palpable. David felt a mix of anger and sadness hearing his brother speak. He wanted to scream, to accuse, but there was something genuine in Bradley's voice that made him hesitate. "You can't just apologize and think everything is resolved, Bradley," David shouted, frustration spilling over. "Your actions have consequences. You need to understand that." Bradley took a deep breath, tears now streaming down his face as well. "I know I can't erase what I did, but I want to change. I want to fight against this. I don't want to be the man I was. If there is a chance for redemption, I want to seize it." The audience began to murmur, and the tension started to dissipate. David's gaze softened. He realized that behind the frustration and resentment was a glimmer of hope. If you truly want to change, then you need to start acting. Not just words, but actions. Join us, Bradley. Use your position to make a difference. "I will do that," Bradley replied, his voice now more resolute. "I will commit to fighting against racism and injustice. For you, for your mother, and for all the victims who have suffered." The room erupted in applause, the sound echoing like a roar of support. David looked at his mother, who was now smiling through her tears, a smile of relief and hope. She slowly stood up, walking toward Bradley. "I accept your apology," she said, her voice gentle yet firm, "and I hope you truly find a path to redemption. We all deserve a second chance." The atmosphere was charged with emotion, and the community, now united, began to chant words of support, calling for change and justice. David felt empowered. He looked at Bradley, who still appeared shaken, but now with renewed determination. "Let's do this together then," David said, extending his hand. "Let's fight for a better future." Bradley took David's hand, and the room erupted in applause. The transformation was just beginning, but the possibility of change was palpable. As Mrs. Joe, Evelyn watched, a smile forming on her face. She knew that the truth had prevailed, and finally, there was a chance for healing for all those blood ties that bound them together, despite their differences. We've reached the end of this touching story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Right now, there's a playlist of videos on your screen. If you want to keep watching these moving stories, just click on it and you'll start watching. Now tell us in the comments which city you're watching from and leave a like to support our work. Here's a sincere question. Do you agree with what happened in the story? We'd love to hear your opinion. Until the next video.